expect two things from his suspension system: quietness and a smooth, comfortable ride. So, springs and shock absorbers and bushings should be seen and not heard.
Say, Tech, you did a pretty good job of acting in that film.
Thanks, Bill. Of course, I ain't no matinee idol.
Yeah, but I'd still say you're a lot better actor than you are a mechanic.
Listen, Gus, do I have to take that from this drugstore Casanova?
Don't go blowing your top, Tech. Bill's just kidding. We want you to stick around for the meeting and give us some of the fine points on troubleshooting the suspension system.
Yeah, Tech, I wish somebody'd straighten me out on that shock absorber service, for one thing.
Okay, Bill, I forgives you. Of course, Eddie's a suspension expert and Steve's a loop man. They can give you the answers. I'll just pass on the tips I picked up at other dealerships.
All right, Eddie. To start this meeting off, why don't we explain how shock absorbers operate?
Okay, Gus, that's a good idea.
A shock absorber is made up of a piston working in a cylinder full of fluid. The piston end is fastened so that it moves with the frame, and the cylinder end is fastened so that it moves with the axle. As the piston moves in the cylinder, it forces fluid through small holes and valves that lead to the other side of the piston. The small holes will pass enough fluid to let the piston move slowly on a gentle bump, but they offer high resistance to sharp jolts.
Sure. The shock absorbers make it possible to use easy-riding springs. The shocks smooth out the action of the springs on bumps and make the ride more comfortable. But they don't support the frame.
Yeah, but if the shocks aren't working, the car will bounce like a rubber check. Eddie, show 'em what I mean on that job over there.
Sure, Tech. If the car bounces 2 or 3 times after you start it moving up and down by pulling or pushing on the bumper, you can be sure the shocks aren't doing their job. Now, if you pull the shocks to make a bench test, here's a couple of points to remember. First thing is to clamp the shock in a vise, piston end up.
Yeah, but don't ever test the shock while it's lying on its side, fellas.
Sure, if you pump a shock while it's on its side, you let air into the pressure cylinder. Then the shock won't test right until you stand it up straight and pump the air out.
Now, if the piston sticks so that you can't push it in, or if it just slides in and out without any resistance at all, you know the shock will have to be replaced.
Of course, you want to remember there's a difference between the feel of front and rear shocks, fellas.
There sure is, Tech. Front shocks ought to show resistance in both directions, but the rear shocks show most resistance as they extend. So, don't make the mistake of thinking a rear shock is no good because you don't feel much resistance when you push the two parts together.
Say, Eddie, what kind of shock absorber noise have you run into?
Well, for one thing, Steve, there's a sort of chuckling noise. You sometimes hear it when you start out slowly after the car stood for a while, especially in cold weather.
But, Steve, that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the shocks. It's just that the fluid gets thick when the car is not in use, and that makes the valves noisy. The noise should disappear as soon as the shocks get a little exercise. If you think you hear noises in the shocks after they've warmed up, you can check by unhooking them and road testing the car at moderate speed.
If you still hear the noise after you've disconnected the shocks, you can be sure they weren't causing the trouble.
Yeah, but hold on a second, Eddie. Remember, the shock absorber mountings can cause noise even though the shocks are all right.
Right, Tech. So when you're hunting for noises, you want to look for worn rubber mountings and loose shock absorber studs. If they're in bad shape, you've got to replace them.
Say, Gus, how come the rear shock absorbers lean in on the new model cars?
That type of mounting is the latest improvement in ride control, Bill. It makes the shock absorbers do double duty. In addition to controlling the springs, they help keep the rear of the car steady on a rough road. Now, remember this about shock absorber bushings. Lubricant. Every kind of lubricant is poison for that type of rubber bushings, fellas. Lubricant makes them slip and wear out. Same thing goes for the sway eliminator mountings and rear spring rubber bushings. You see, those rubber bushings are designed to make a tight fit between the rods or studs and the eyes. When the rod or stud turns, the inner and outer surfaces of the bushing stick to the metal, and all the twisting takes place inside the rubber. Now, if you lubricate the bushing, the outer and inner surfaces are going to slip on the metal. That causes rapid wear and noise.
Right, Gus. I never use any kind of lubricant on rubber mountings. That goes for special rubber lubes and sprays or liquid soaps.
How about taking a minute to explain how the sway eliminator works, Gus?
Well, think of it this way, Bill. The sway eliminator acts like an extra spring that automatically strengthens the spring on the low side when the car begins to tip. The car can't tip very much to one side without twisting the sway eliminator rod, and it is pretty stiff. Of course, the sway eliminator doesn't affect the springs as long as they both compress the same amount, because in that case, both ends move in the same direction and the rod doesn't twist.
Did that straighten you out on sway eliminators, Bill?
Yep, but I'm coming right back with another question. What happens if the springs on a car begin to sag?
Well, Bill, if the springs sag equally, the body settles and the car may bottom on small bumps. Another thing, if you've got a weak front spring on one side of the car, you may not be able to adjust camber properly. That's why I always check the spring heights if I can't get the wheel straight up and down with the camber adjustment.
Do you have to pull the springs out to check them?
Nope. The first thing you do is check to make sure there's no heavy luggage or tools on one side of the car to weight it down unevenly.
Yeah, if one rear spring is 3/4 of an inch or more lower than the other, the front spring heights will be affected.
Then you set the car up on a level floor and check the tires to make sure they're all at the same pressure. Next, you find the difference between the heights of the grease fittings on the inner and outer end of one lower control arm. Then, you find the difference between the heights of the grease fittings on the other control arm. Compare the figures for one side with the figures for the other side. If there's more than 1/4 of an inch difference, the spring on one side is too low. You can correct for unequal spring heights by installing spacers at the top of the low spring. Each spacer will raise the car about 5/16 of an inch.
Right, Eddie. But I think we ought to warn the fellas that if you have to use more than 2 spacers to level the front end, the spring coils will close up on bumps. And remember, both springs can be of equal height, but if they're weak, they may bottom even on small bumps. If that happens, you'll have to replace the springs.
Yeah, and if you don't want the job to bounce right back at you, you gotta use replacement springs with the right part number for that particular car.
Now I think we ought to say a few things about control arm bushings. First,
The first thing we gotta do is to turn this record over so you won't be talking to yourself.
now the control arm pins and bushings have got to turn freely. In order to prevent binding, the bushings are built with a lot of clearance, more than you may think is necessary.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean they're too loose.
I catch check. The pin rides on one side of the bushing and the clearance is all at the other side. But doesn't the pin shift when you hit a bump or a hole?
No, Bill, the pin can't shift when the car's on the road because the springs always keep pressure in the same direction.
Here's something we might mention. Once in a while, you'll find a case where the lubricant won't go into the upper control arm bushings. When that happens, you want to bounce the car a few times while shooting the lube in before you condemn the bushings or the grease fittings.
Don't take any chances on missing those upper control arms, fellas. They've got to be lubricated regularly to prevent noise and wear.
There are a couple of tricks to remember when you're replacing control arm bushings. For one thing, you want to use the special tools to spread the inner ends of the control arms. You see, you got to tighten the upper control arm bushings to at least 120 foot-pounds, and the lower control arm bushings to at least 165 foot-pounds torque.
Right, and the special tools keep the ends from closing up when you lay on the wrench. Now, here's something else. Make sure those pivot bars and steering knuckle supports are centered in both your upper and lower control arms.
Sure. If the pivot bars aren't centered, the caster will be affected. And you may push the expansion plugs out of the lower control arm bushings when you tighten them up. And when you're installing new dust seals in the upper control arms, protect them with the special tool so the bushing won't cut them as you slide it into place.
Well, that just about winds up the front suspension, fellas. What do you think we ought to say about rear springs, Tech?
I say get the fellas' opinions on spring noises.
When the rear springs run dry, you get spring slap, don't you?
That's right, Steve. Spring slap is a noise caused by the spring leaves moving sideways. To correct spring slap, you lubricate the springs thoroughly. Maybe you could give us some tips on that, Steve.
Well, the main thing is you've got to use the lubricant that's recommended for rear springs. It's the only lubricant that'll stay between the leaves and prevent noise and wear. I always jack up the rear end of a car, and that unloads the springs and separates the leaves to make room for the lubricant. Another thing, I always screw the nozzle of the lubricating clamp all the way through the inner fabric cover. Then I'm sure the lubricant will reach the leaves.
But say, Steve, don't you have to drill a hole through the metal cover first?
Not often. Usually there's a hole already there. Of course, if there wasn't one, you'd have to drill a 3/16 hole. After you've shot the lube to the springs, be sure to put a plug in the hole to keep the dirt and water out and the lubricant in.
Now, Bill, in an unusual case, if lubrication doesn't stop spring slap, then you cut a slot in the spring covers and install disc inserts to separate the leaves. You install the inserts with the prongs up between the main leaf and the number 2 leaf. You'll find the story for doing this job in the reference book.
Does lubricating the springs or putting in those inserts always stop the spring slap, Eddie?
Usually, but on older cars, you may have to replace the springs.
What about lubricating the spring shackles, Steve?
Look, didn't Steve just get through saying you can't put any kind of lubricant on rubber bushings? It'll ruin them.
That's right, Bill. But you should check all spring mounting bolts for tightness. The front eye bolt should be tightened to at least 150 foot-pounds torque. The spring shackles should be tightened to 35 to 40 foot-pounds torque, and the U-bolts to between 60 and 70.
Eddie, what's your first step in correcting these noise complaints we've been talking about?
First thing I do is make sure the noise isn't coming from loose tools in the trunk, a loose spare tire, or loose front and rear bumpers. Then, I road test the car with the customer and listen for the noise he's complaining about to make sure it's a suspension noise. Now, if I back up slowly, put on the brakes, and hear a clunking noise, then pull ahead, put on the brakes, and hear the same noise, I'm pretty sure the clunking noise is coming from loose bushings in the steering knuckle support.
Yeah, and if the lower bushings are loose, you've got to disconnect the support from the control arm and replace them.
Sometimes I hear a chucking noise in the rear end on rough roads, especially on damp days. That's usually spring slap or axle shaft end play.
Right. To check for end play in the rear axle shaft, you jack up the rear end and try to move the rear wheel in and out. Now, if there's no end play, you lower the car to the floor and shake it sideways at the rear. If you still hear the noise, you know it's probably spring slap.
If I figure the shocks are causing noise when I drive the car at moderate speeds, I disconnect them and road test the car again. If the noise is gone, I figure it's the shocks or their mountings. Then I inspect the shock absorber rubber bushings for wear and see that the studs are tight. If they're okay, I know I've got to replace the shocks. If the noise was still there after I disconnected the shocks, I'd know the shocks were okay and I'd head back for the shop. At the shop, I tighten the spring eye bolts, U-bolts, and the shackle bolts to make sure they're not making the noise.
Did you ever run into interference between the spring shackle and the frame, Eddie?
Yeah, if the spring is twisted, you'll get wear inside the bushing and maybe interference between the shackle and the frame. That causes noise.
Some of the fellas have corrected interference by loosening the U-bolts so the spring can straighten up. Then, of course, they tighten them again.
If that didn't work, you'd have to replace the spring. Of course, if the interference is on the inside of the frame, you can sometimes relieve it by filing the channel.
When you're tracking down noise, you also want to check for loose, damaged, or missing rubber bumpers, and loose sway eliminator mountings, loose pivot bar attaching bolts, And loose steering knuckles support clamp screws.
Well, okay for suspension noise. What have you fellas got to say about ride complaints?
Well, I'd like somebody to answer me a question, Gus.
Go ahead, Steve.
What's wrong when a car pitches like a boat in a rough sea?
Could be faulty shock absorbers, Steve.
Yeah, faulty shocks can let the car pitch, but that's not all. Another thing that causes pitching is stiffness or friction in the front suspension linkage or in the rear springs. And of course, if the linkage or springs are stiff, the driver will complain of a hard ride and perhaps a steering difficulty at high speed.
Say, Eddie, do you figure cars ever take a dislike to a particular stretch of road? Seems to me my car bumps on the rear axle every time I drive down Elm Street.
You mean where the road's been repaired at that intersection?
Yeah, that's the spot.
You're running into a thank you, ma'am, Bill.
A what?
Thank you, ma'am. That's a broad hump in the road that makes your suspension hit bottom with a jolt if you drive over it at the right speed.
To stop the suspension from bottoming, all you gotta do is to cut down to a slower speed, Bill.
And, Tech, I guess we're down to the bottom of this subject. That is, unless you've got something else to say.
Just this, Gus. Comfort and quietness are two things a customer's got a right to expect from his car. And remember, if you pay attention to the things that keep the owner satisfied with his car, you won't have to worry about keeping customers satisfied with your service.